Okay, so welcome everyone to this new session in our Space Education and Strategic Applications Conference 2023. We are in room 2, and now we have the opportunity to listen to this panel, Considerations on Space Technology and Innovation. Thank you for being here. And I want to present briefly our speakers this morning. First, we have Professor Simon Evett from Blue Abyss from the United Kingdom, and he will be talking about space as a crucible for innovation. And after that, we will have Professor Anthony Milligan from the Cosmological Visionaries Project at King's College at London, talking about if our space technologies ultimately, okay? So I will give the word to Professor Evans. You will have half an hour. And yeah, let's enjoy your presentation. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. So I will share my screen. And let's pull up my slides. There we go. Oh, a good morning or good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on whereabouts you are. As Mauricio said, my name is Simon Everts. I come from the field of human spaceflight. I've either been researching or involved in human spaceflight operations for the last 30 years, a little bit more on the commercial business side of the last few years. And what I want to talk to you about is the fact that we know that the environment of space is difficult, it's challenging, there are a great deal of constraints. This makes it tricky to work and to live and to conduct activities in this environment, but at the same time, it forces us to develop new processes, new procedures, to innovate effectively. And those innovations are beneficial not just for space, but also for Earth. So that's the essence of the talk that I'm going to give you over the next 20-30 minutes. Space is dangerous. We all know that. That environment is dangerous. And okay, I'm being a little bit flippant with the nature of this slide, but it expresses what we want to convey here. I come from the field of human spaceflight. I'm a space life scientist. I worked in the field of medical operations. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be using that field for examples. But we categorize the hazards of space nowadays in these 5 categories you can see ahead in front of you: space radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth, gravity or lack of or reduced gravity, or indeed hypergravity. We're looking at launch and return, and hostile and closed environments. So we've got these categories of hazards that can cause and can disrupt the human body and its operations. As I mentioned, space medicine is my field. I'm a space life scientist, so I will focus on this for exemplars of what we're going to discuss. So going back to those 5 hazard categories, there's a plethora of effects for each. If we're looking at altered gravity, then we see balance disorders, we see cardiovascular deconditioning, we see muscle and bone atrophy, etc. A very common, not very common, but I should say an important area of research right now is SANS, the spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. So that's where we're seeing acute and chronic effects on vision and the visual apparatus. Space radiation, there are acute, there are chronic effects. If we're looking at the distance from Earth, then the very fact that we're so far from Earth, as I'm sure everyone here listening will understand, means that it's difficult to replace things. It means that we need to have what we need with us. It means that resources typically are very finite when we're in space. If we're looking at the hostile closed environment, then of course it's the environment itself. We've got vacuum, we've got high temperature differences, we've got the lack of oxygen. If we're looking at a space station such as ISS, chronically high CO2 levels. So there's a whole host of factors there. And although I'm going to focus on physiology, medicine, the body, there's the mind as well, of course. Isolation and confinement is one of the primary categories that will affect our cognitive ability, our psychological health and well-being, even with regards to group dynamics and team effects. So there's a whole host that's going on. Dangers and stresses are causing these many and varied effects. So going back to that point, space is dangerous. And the further out we go, if we're going to the moon, if we're going to Mars, there are new dangers, there are new hazards. We are going to, and indeed are wrapping our heads around how to deal with these many and varied risks and hazards and dangers as we move further out into space. Many dangers, many stresses, they cause needs. So we need to be able to deal with the deconditioning that altered gravity causes. We need to be able to deal with the risk of space radiation, whether that be acute, whether that be chronic. We need to be able to deal with this issue of distance from Earth, where we have too little, too few resources. Hostile closed environment. We need to be able to live in those environments. With regards to isolation and confinement, we need to be able to be prepared as individuals, but also as teams, as crews, to be able to function effectively in these isolated and confined environments. So there are these dangers and there are these stresses, and they lead to needs, or they have an impact on needs. And therefore, we can say space drives the needs for countermeasures. With regards to deconditioning, astronauts exercise typically for up to 2 hours per day, about 6 days a week when they're in space. So we need countermeasures and appropriate countermeasures for long duration exposure to space. We need preventative healthcare measures. We need remote and autonomous healthcare when we are out there and are not able to call upon Earth as quickly and as easily as we can at the moment. We need technological support, whether this is semi-autonomous or, in some cases, ideally autonomous. There is a need for that. So as we delve deeper into space, as our ambitions push us further out into space, we have to innovate more, and space forces us to do that. It forces us, because of the constraints that we have, it has on our operations, because of the constraints it has on our equipment and our procedures. For instance, equipment and apparatus needs to be small. It needs to have a small volume, a small footprint, a small mass. The consumables that we use need to last a long time, i.e. they need to have a long shelf life. Hardware needs to have low power consumption because power is limited in space. Hardware should have low and simple maintenance requirements so that the hardware will last a long time and doesn't need a lot of time and effort to maintain. The procedures for using the hardware and the procedures for doing operational activities need to be simple to minimize the amount of crew time. And the hardware needs to be durable and it needs to be robust so that it doesn't have to be replaced regularly, so that it doesn't break easily. We've got this sphere of endeavor, which has such challenges that it means that the only way that we can live and work in space is to innovate. These constraints are forcing us to innovate, to provide the solutions to the needs that we talked about a few moments ago. So we have a formula. Need plus constraint equals innovation. This is the formula that we want to talk about today, and for which I'm going to give you some examples. Let's look historically back at Skylab. Skylab was the first lab in space, if you like, 3 missions, and the primary purpose of NASA's Skylab missions was to understand how space affects the human body over a long period of time, and how we can live and work effectively with minimal risk in space. The in-flight medical support system that they had there enabled them and was there and designed to allow injuries and illnesses, should they occur, to be dealt with, but also to enable research to be conducted. And there was a great deal of research that was pursued. Blood samples were key to a number of those elements of that research, and quite a lot of blood would have been required over the weeks and months of those missions. At that time, at the beginning of Skylab, to get the sort of information that was sought, fairly large blood samples needed to be taken, in the region of 60 ml samples. And with the constraints imposed, that was awkward. We didn't have the ability to store that much blood over, with regards to the later missions, months of time, and we didn't have the ability to continually return that much blood. So the need existed for the quantity of blood required for the information that we wanted to acquire from that blood to be reduced, and significantly. So research was pursued, a fairly substantial research program, and that led to the development of smaller devices, of more automated laboratory processes, and importantly, the ability to ascertain the information required from blood with much smaller samples, 6 ml. So that's a magnitude reduction in the size of the blood samples. We see here at that time, the need and the constraints, they didn't exist on the ground, hence, or at that point, 6 ml blood samples were not standard. But the need did exist in space for Skylab. The constraints were there, hence it drove the innovation that led to these smaller blood samples being able to do as much as we needed them to do. And terrestrial medicine gained, of course, from these space life science, space medicine successes. Deconditioning occurs in space. If we don't exercise, virtually all of our physiological systems are affected if we don't have the right countermeasures. And in particular, some of the physiological systems will will age, in a sense, 6-7 times faster than on Earth. We see that space deconditioning, it has parallels with aging on Earth. And as we all know, certainly in the West, we've got a sedentary, ever aging society, and therefore a great deal of healthcare needs. Let's look at some examples. At about the time I left the European Astronaut Centre in Cologne, the year-long missions were starting, and that program envisaged at the time to have at least 12 astronauts spend at least a year in space to really enable us to properly understand, one, what's happening to the body, two, to better research the countermeasures required. Kelly was the first. He had his twin on the ground while he was in space. And one of the interesting things we saw there were that his telomeres, so these are the caps on the end of chromosomes, his telomeres, they lengthened in space, which was not what we were expecting. We tend to see that telomeres shorten as an age-related condition. It's an age-related factor, so it was a surprise and a useful finding. Understanding how space affects then the telomeres and will provide insight into age-related diseases and conditions. I would imagine that the increases that we saw were related to the exercise and dietary regimes that the crew, and in particular in this case Scott, adopted in space. Most of his telomeres returned to pre-flight length a number of months after returning from space. And it's of note that most astronauts, although healthy and fit, do not exercise to quite the degree, quite the frequency, quite the intensity on Earth as they do in space. So hence there could well be this link, which further strengthens our belief that exercise and dietary, a proper diet, is important for our health, but also with regards to maintaining a youthful health, if you like. Other changes were noted: bone strength, muscle and connective tissue strength, locomotor performance, gut microbiome. We saw changes and numerous other changes. And what I'll do is just have an example, a brief example for each of those 4 points there. Let's look at bone. We know that if we apply impact through the bone, through a bone, that bone will respond. It will be stimulated to be strong, to be able to counter that stimulus, that impact. Space life science research has also shown us that torsion and bending of bone stimulates it. This is important because with regards to terrestrial healthcare, we should make sure that our focus is moving from simply loading magnitude, which we know, to loading patterns. It's not just providing an impact through a bone, it's how is that impact, or how is that stimulus being provided through the bone that is important. So the form of exercise is as important as the fact of exercise if we want to maintain good, strong, healthy bone. If we look at muscles and tendons, we know that muscle atrophies. We see muscle fibers shortening in space. Space analogs on the ground have shown increased tendon compliance and reduced collagen diameter. What we've got here are changes in the morphology of muscles and tendons, are affecting the absolute strength and also the ability to apply force, the ability to apply that strength. Our ability to understand how tendons adapt to different mechanical loading conditions then enables us and provides us with insights into musculoskeletal conditions and injuries, so that we can better facilitate rehabilitation from such conditions. If someone spends a great deal of time in bed, if they're in hospital for a long period of time, for instance, on getting up from bed, they will suffer from postural instability. Their balance will be affected. Space life science research has shown that, and looking at bed rest in this particular case, that if you have those individuals periodically simply stand for a period of time, or ideally have a little mild form of locomotion, a bit of a walk around before going back to bed, that actually reduces the impact on postural instability when they are finally able to get up from bed. So short periods of standing or simple locomotion are beneficial in reducing instability post-bed rest. So this aids our understanding and our ability to provide mitigation strategies for long-term bed rest or hospitalization. So what we should be doing is, ideally, if we're able to, is where we have someone who is elderly, who's spending a long period of time in hospital, for instance, to try and have them at least stand periodically during their period of hospitalization, of bed rest. Oh, my 2 arrows have got ahead of themselves there. Use that. Looking at nutrition, we are aware that if we want to maintain our muscle mass, we should eat enough protein in our diet. Space life science research is actually indicating that excessive protein can have a negative effect on bone, and that research has shown that bone resorption is increased with excessive protein intake. So here we've got a case of, it's not just a question of an adequate mix and quantity of nutrition that is required for optimal health, but the appropriate mix and quantity. In this case, too much protein cannot necessarily be a good thing. Too much protein can have a negative effect. So looking ahead, what is required for us to optimally live and work in space, reduce risk and hazards. We need to better understand the etiology underpinning the effects of exposure to the space environment. We need to establish better means to prevent and counter space-induced deconditioning. We need to establish contingency plans and mechanisms to minimize medical risks and optimize treatment and emergency procedures. To improve long-term skill retention and remote distance training capabilities is important. If we just think about a Mars mission, 2 or 3 year round trip, and there's a physician on board, and should the one and only medical emergency occur towards the end of that trip, that physician, he or she, needs to have maintained their ability, their knowledge, their capabilities, throughout that period to be able to react optimally at the end of that 2-3 year mission. So skill retention and maintenance of capability is very important. We need to be able to develop effective remote healthcare methodologies and equipment, and develop improved means of autonomous healthcare. There you see an image of SkinSuit. Andreas Mogensen, a Danish astronaut, wore that briefly in space. It was a research study I led for ESA for a while. If we've got items like that, that's not operational at the moment, but should that or something similar become operational, a skin suit like that is constricting the body. It's putting forces, stimulus through the body, through the bones, causing the muscles to work. So you've got an autonomous activity occurring that improves and aids health whilst the astronaut carries on his or her other activities. And we need to better understand, prevent, diagnose, and treat psychological, social, and group dynamic perturbations. So again, I've been focusing on physiological, on medical, but there is the psychological side of things. Cognitive ability, psychological health and well-being are both affected in many cases adversely by these hazard categories we were talking about. So of course we need to be able to innovate to enable those to be dealt with as well. Tomorrow's needs. If we're going to explore, if we're going to go deeper into space and go longer in space, we need the research for today that we conduct today to provide the innovation that we can use tomorrow. We will need to be able to maintain difficult to acquire skill sets, operate efficiently and safely in space or on a low-G planetary body, and conduct critical healthcare practices semi-autonomously, and in some cases, if we can, autonomously. We need to be self-sufficient and resilient. And we need to have access to intelligent and expansive healthcare databases. And ideally, we need to prevent deconditioning altogether if we can. So, as we've seen over the last few slides, space is tough, but we knew that. We need to remind ourselves, it forces us to find new ways of doing things. Yes, that's hard work, but it's a good thing when we find we have done these innovations. So looking at translation to Earth, the products, the capabilities, the processes, the knowledge that we derive from this space life science and space medicine research translates to the needs of an aging and sedentary society, where we find we have improved preventative medicine. We get improved understanding of deconditioning and its prevention. We get technology for remote healthcare. We get more autonomous health monitoring and reporting, more robust and resilient technology out in the community where we don't want that kit breaking easily, being damaged easily. So there is a win-win here. And I think the take-homes, 3 take-homes here, are that we should embrace these constraints. It forces us to innovate, and where we might not otherwise have done so. We should highlight that the budgets, the funds that are being expended by the space sector. Yes, it enables us to travel out and live and work in space, but it also supports terrestrial healthcare needs. And we should publicize the fact that by preparing to be able to go out and conduct these explorations of our solar system that we're going to do, this need not detract from our ability to solve issues on this planet. And in fact, it helps. Attempting to live in space helps life on Earth. So with that, I hope you found that interesting. Thank you for your attention, and I will hand back to Maurizio.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all these different focuses. Now I will give the word to Professor Anthony Milligan. He is a research fellow of the Cosmological Visionaries Project at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London. Sorry for that. And he will talk about the question, are space technologies untimely? So please go ahead, Professor. And remember, to all the attendees, you can add your questions to the Q&A section of the Zoom, okay? We will acknowledge that by the end of the presentation. So yeah, thank you. And Professor Anthony Milligan, all yours.
Just sharing just now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Here. Okay. Right. Slideshow. Okay, this is going to be a philosophical, ethical approach, looking at the question of whether space technologies are untimely. And when I refer to untimeliness, it is an idea which is built into various forms of skepticism about human activities in space, or at least skepticism about the more ambitious forms of human activity beyond having some kind of orbital infrastructure. So the idea behind such skepticism is typically that eventually we will go. So they're not crazy. They don't think that they can put a permanent ban for the rest of human history on ambitious projects in space. They simply say that not now. They're not saying never. Now, this draws upon a background intuition that there are probably points in time in human history when we would not want people to have the relevant technologies to go into space, because those technologies could be weaponized in dangerous ways. The 1930s and the 1940s would probably be one of the most obvious examples. We wouldn't have wanted the Nazis to have access to this kind of technology. So it's not a crazy idea to say that, well, we do want the technology perhaps, but we want it to emerge at a particular point in time in human history when we're in the best position to use it, or at least we want it to emerge at a point in time when it is not going to be tremendously dangerous for humans to possess the technology. We want it to emerge in a timely manner rather than an untimely manner. Now, all technologies are untimely with respect to something. You get technological advance and there are beneficiaries, but sometimes there are people who lose out as well for at least a period of time. Or you have advances in technology and humans benefit, but non-human creatures are disadvantaged and so on. And that's fairly normal, and you draw up some kind of balance sheet about the pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages. The kind of untimeliness that will concern me here is quite a generalized sort of untimeliness. It is untimeliness relative to the current challenges facing humanity, such as how we respond to climate change. Now, claiming untimeliness of this sort, that generalized sort, is a really big claim. And if something is untimely relative to the current challenges facing humanity, then it's probably a technology that we would want to set aside, walk away from, or something of that sort. Now, there have been various claims about the untimeliness of space technologies in the past. The best version of these, I think, comes in the short stories of J.G. Ballard, who began writing in the 1960s about the space program. He thought this isn't going where people think it's going. It isn't going to develop into a fully blown space age. And he was right about that. But the sense that he had of the thing was, again, and you see this in various interviews that he gave at the time, and again in the 1970s, the stories were written over a long period of time. He had a sense that eventually, yes, we will go into space, we will have a genuine space age, we will have large-scale infrastructure in space, but not yet. It's not happening now. This isn't the time. And one can well understand that when one looks at some of the technology. And if one looks at a capsule of that time period, one thinks, why did anyone think it was a good idea to step inside of one of those and get themselves put at the top of a rocket? It's extremely dangerous. Another example, a bit more contemporary, is from Daniel Doudnay in his book Dark Skies, which is an excellent skeptical work about human activities in space. So I'm not a space skeptic. Daniel Doudnay is. It's an excellent book to read. Just make sure it's not the only book that you read about space. And Doudnay puts matters in the following terms. The pursuit of ambitious space expansion must now prudentially be judged to be deeply undesirable for humanity and the Earth for at least several centuries. So again, you get the idea that it's absurd to imagine that we can legislate for people several centuries down the line, or many centuries down the line, but for a period of time, thinkers such as Doudnay believe that we can put off large-scale expansion in space and that we ought to do so. I don't think that Ballard had a similar timescale in mind. I think he was envisaging decades, perhaps a century, not the multiple centuries that Daniel Doudnay seems to be thinking of. So it's quite a strong claim here. Okay, so there are a number of typical reasons advanced for untimeliness. One is military tensions of the sort that Doudnay points to, and that comes in the form of aggravating tensions on the ground. And we can see that that's plausible, that anything like competition in space between the US and China would have ground level repercussions, and there are no guarantees that those would be good. Matters could go well or they could go badly. Doudnay thinks that they would typically go badly. And there are a number of other factors as well, such as the prospect that asteroids could be fired at the Earth as kinetic weapons. That can happen, but it's not easy to capture an asteroid, and the technologies to redirect trajectory would be also the technologies which would typically be used to try and intercept any asteroid fired at the Earth, and it takes a long time for an asteroid to get here. So it's not a given that this is that the skies are quite as dark as Doudnay suspects, but that's a typical reason, and it's a familiar reason. He's not the only person who thinks this. It is a widespread thought, and it's a worthwhile thought, because if anything of that sort was to happen, then the consequences for human civilization would be terrible. So in the past, I've referred to Doudna as someone who's giving us the kind of skepticism that we need to hear. It's not a skepticism I share, but it is the kind of skepticism that has a good deal going for it. The second typical reason is one that concerns bad technological feedback, particularly in the form of geoengineering. And while it's the case that we are a good distance away from any prospect of something like terraforming Mars or engaging in large-scale geoengineering on Mars, it is something that the human activities in space raise the prospect of, and we begin to look at the possibility of the technologies that would allow us to do that. And of course, in a time of climate change, there's a great temptation to think that we might be able to apply these technologies on Earth as well. So typically, the people who point to, say, the military tensions or the other reason that I'm going to get onto in a minute, they will also be, many of them are also interested in critiques of terraforming and critiques of geoengineering and its applications to Earth. Now, those first two reasons are fairly decent reasons. These things need to be looked into. I don't buy into either of them, but that's not to say that they're implausible. The third one is a little bit different, and this is the neglecting Earth argument, and it's really a populist response. It doesn't have the same, as it were, intellectual rigor of concerns about bad technological feedback or fears about aggravating military tensions. Note here that when I'm flagging up these three typical reasons, that's enough to start generating tensions between them. And two of the claims at least have tension. If one says neglecting Earth because one's looking at space, it becomes difficult then to say that one has bad feedback, because suddenly you've got much more of a cyclical process and you've got systemic integration. And neglecting Earth looks away from the idea of systemic integration, and bad technological feedback looks much more towards that idea. And two of the ideas, two of the reasons offered for claiming untimeliness probably intersect with one another. They're both, in a sense, feedback claims. Doudna's worried about military feedback, and critics of geoengineering are worried about a different kind of feedback. But they're both feedback type arguments, and the agents involved in bringing about the problems might tend to overlap. Okay, so that's what I think are the three dominant reasons offered. There are other reasons that are out there. There's probably a different way to cut up this cake as well. So don't think that I'm claiming that this is the unique way in which one can make sense of what's going on in untimeliness claims, especially when they tend not to be particularly systematic, or when they appear in texts very briefly and then vanish before you really get a sense of what's going on. Okay, so none of them are wildly convincing. Military tensions argument assumes avoidability. So Doudna thinks that we can actually, at this point, stop what we're doing, and that's not immediately obvious. And I tend to think, look, if we're going to be doing this, then we want to make sure that the political conditions on the ground are reasonable for us to do that, and we don't have any guarantees about what the political conditions on the ground are likely to be, say 50 years down the line or 100 years down the line, certainly not several hundred years down the line, and whether anything that has the good features of liberal democracy will still be in place. And that's tremendously important, I think, that we go with something like liberal democratic institutions on the ground, because the way that you start things tends to shape what happens afterwards. Sometimes people refer to that as founder effect, and I buy into that up to a point. The bad technological feedback claim, they've got a point. Nobody likes the idea, or well, many of us don't like the idea of geoengineering, and there are good reasons not to. Humans are not that. We don't have a great track record of controlling technologies of this sort. And one thinks of dam building projects and anything of that kind. It did not go well. So we have some reasons for caution about this kind of thing. However, and I say this with a degree of reluctance and sadness, at some point in time, if we continue to behave quite as badly as we have done in relation to the environment, then we'll lose the option of keeping geoengineering off the table. So if we expect future continued bad behavior by humans, then we will face the consequences of that in the form of some kind of tragic dilemma. But do we do one bad thing or another bad thing? What is the least worst option that we will face? And I think that's where we're probably heading, towards a tragic dilemma, a situation in which we end up doing things that we really don't want to do. And geoengineering might be among that. So trying to keep the effort to keep geoengineering entirely out of the picture might not work, which it did. And finally, neglecting Earth. And this really underestimates the importance of space in our understanding of climate change. We got hold of what was going on with the greenhouse effect in the 1980s really, really quickly because of research that had been conducted on Mars and especially on Venus, where we'd seen a runaway global warming process. So when the satellite data started to come in a reliable form in the 80s, it was quickly recognized by people like Jim Hansen at NASA. They knew exactly what was going on because of the Mars and Venus research. And even when you think of someone like some of the people who are involved in Gaia theory, like James Lovelock. Now, Lovelock doesn't arrive at Gaia, the Gaia idea that Earth behaves like a giant organism. Strictly speaking, it's the surface area of the Earth that he's interested in. He doesn't arrive at that simply by looking at Earth. Lovelock starts off as a Mars researcher, and he's fascinated by the way in which the interactions between the Martian surface and the Martian atmosphere differ from the interactions between the Earth's surface and the Earth's atmosphere. So again, it's out of that phase of Mars and Venus research that the Gaia theory actually emerges. And you can see this right along the line. Our understanding of the Earth as a planet doesn't come simply from looking at the Earth. It comes from conducting planetary science, and planetary science is a multi-body activity. So in obvious respects, if we want to understand what's happening with the melting of ice caps on Earth, then we look at other places that have got ice caps. We look at the poles on Mars and how they behave and what's happened to them historically. And we look at cryosystems and near to the South Lunar Pole and so on. And if we want to understand the Earth as a water world, then we look at other water worlds. And that's how you contextualize this thing. That's how you come to a better and fuller understanding of the Earth's environmental systems. So the idea that by looking elsewhere, you're somehow neglecting the Earth, it's a bit like saying that when you love someone, that has nothing to do with yourself. You don't have a sense that this is someone that I could be happy with. So here I'm drawing an analogy, saying that love is about more than one thing. There's always, when you love someone in that way, it's really, it looks like it's only the other person that you're concerned with, but really you're concerned with both of you. And thinking about Mars is a bit like that as well. and thinking about other planets is a bit like that as well. When the planetary science is conducted, we're always continuously thinking about Earth as well. We're seeing that planetary science in the context of what we know about Earth, and we're seeing what we know about Earth in the context of that planetary science. So it's systemic, again, using a Galilean term that comes from looking at space, and it's then applied to notions such as ecosystem. So the very idea of a system comes from space research. But the neglecting Earth comes from a very simplistic understanding of human psychology, in which we have intentionality about one object at a time, and rather than mixed intentionality. Ways of thinking about one object are often shaped by the ways in which we interact with others. And I think the more complex psychology is a better model. Okay, I'm also going to use a concept that I've brought into play in a number of places, and that's the concept of ground bias. And I'm going to say that whatever we think about the other reasons which are offered for untimeliness of space technologies, I'm going to say that the neglecting Earth reason is wildly implicated in ground bias. And here, as a rough definition, ground bias involves an exaggerated disentangling of Earth and space. This occurs when our understanding of Earth at a planetary level is shaped by what happens here at the expense of thinking in more relational terms. This contrasts with thinking about here in the light of elsewhere. So a simpler way to say that would be to say that the problem is that the people who buy into this kind of thing do not see Earth in relational terms. They see it in very isolationist terms, which flows from a certain political history of notions of isolationist belonging, and that's not a history that I really identify with. Okay, so here's what I take to be the kind of claim that's built into the neglecting Earth reason, which is that space technologies are untimely because they distract us from the task of fixing climate change. We ought to fix climate change first, then worry about space. This is actually a morphed version of some arguments which emerged in the early days of modern space programs in the 1960s. But the argument then tended to be that we should only think about space once we've fixed our problems in the inner cities, once we've fixed our problems with urban poverty and so on. So there were some attempts to set up protests saying that the money should be going here rather than there. Okay. And some exemplars to show that I'm not just making all of this stuff up. Everyone thinks of 2021, when there was the race into suborbital space between Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. A lot of strange ideas were kicking around at that time, to the effect that, well, is this the elite preparing a mass escape to Mars? And if you work in the territory of space and you get interviewed about this sort of stuff, then you might recall being asked questions of this sort by interviewers. I was really taken aback at first and thought, this is very, very odd stuff. But then I found out that there was this early in 2021, a couple of months before the race into orbital space began, there was this advert from Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, and it was a spoof. It was a satire. People involved in it were not claiming that this is literal truth, but rather that it tapped into some deeper kind of mythical truth, something of that kind. And it was an advert targeted at the 1%, saying, Mars is this pristine place. Why don't you escape to Mars? And it ends with a punchline. And for the 99% who will stay on Earth, we'd better fix climate change. So again, it's this kind of association with people escaping from the consequences of what humans have done, and that somehow tackling climate change and engaging in in any kind of space expansion are opposed to one another. They are alternatives that you can do one or the other, but that they don't intersect. Okay. And another example of this, because it wasn't Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future people who invented the idea, really it had been kicking around for about a decade beforehand. And you get some of it in very cautious and cagey ways in works by Bruno Latour, who's writing quite a bit about space on and off for the last decade of his his life, and poses this idea that all divisions between left and right go, and what we really have now are divisions between those who show commitment to the Earth and those who are, in some sense, abandoning a shared Earth. So the elite have abandoned solidarity with the rest of humanity and commitment to Earth. These two things, there's a long tradition of associating these two. They had to stop pretending, even in their dreams, to share the Earth with the rest of the world. And you add that together with some other ideas in Latour, such as the idea that the planet is just not big enough for globalist ambitions, that they have to reach out beyond that. And you can see the beginnings of this idea that the 99% need to fight for commitment to the Earth, while the 1% are those who are concerned with space. And of course, you can point to billionaires, and then the argument seems to make some kind of sense, as if they're the only people who are concerned with space, as if we didn't have a much larger community than Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. So that's the story. And the interesting thing here is that while there are a number of instances historically of descent over space, and even descent at launch sites in French Guiana, typically skepticism about space exploration has not been linked to forms of direct protest. But I think that the neglecting Earth claim does open pathways between various kinds of skepticism about space and activities of dissent. That's not saying it's going to happen, that we're going to have people taking to the streets, but I think you're moving closer to significant forms of protest as expansion into space increases. You'll find at least some forms of active dissent off of the pages of periodicals and away from the net, actually, people out in active protests. So I want to kind of conclude by giving a sense of the larger view, the larger kind of skepticism that the neglecting Earth claim is embedded within, because I think this is where we're going in terms of these skeptical arguments. I would like skeptical arguments to be framed in the terms of Daniel Dudnik, erudite and detailed and thoughtful and informative. But I don't think that's the kind of space skepticism which is emerging. I think the kind of skepticism which is emerging is heavily shaped by various kinds of populism, and it places the neglecting Earth claim much more centrally. So I'll run through what I think is the rough shape of things to come in terms of that kind of skepticism, which includes this notion of untimeliness of space technologies. Okay, temporalization. So space is appropriate for the future, but not now. A teleological claim that our problems on Earth will be repeated in space, or made even worse by human activity in space. That's already been mentioned by some speakers earlier. Misplaced attention. So I put this right at the heart. By focusing on space, we're losing sight of the primary importance of the Earth. I think it's not true, but this is the core skeptical claim. Populism, those driving the neglect or abandonment of the Earth in favour of space are the elite, the billionaires, the 1%, whatever formulation you prefer. And finally, an identity claim. We are Earthlings and should remain true to our earthliness, but current space ambitions do not do so. Instead of speaking for space, we should speak for the Earth. Now, I think of ourselves as Earthlings, and there are different ways to articulate that, but I think that there is a fairly static notion of belonging that's involved there, and I think there are some real pastiches of indigenous notions of belonging, which are built into this idea as well. I don't think of indigenous notions of belonging as typically static, but this idea of belonging that gets promoted as part of this, as it were, skeptical formation does seem to be extremely static. So results and prospect. This is where I land on this stuff. There's no convincing case or strongly convincing case for untimeliness. But the best cases appeal to military tensions and bad technological feedback. This is where I think the action should be in terms of discussion and argument. So I am interested in seeing how the attempt to connect up geoengineering critiques on Earth and concerns about terraforming Mars, how that connection is made. That looks interesting and worth looking at. It's not exactly my game, but it's an interesting game, and it might be a worthwhile game to play. Secondly, the least plausible version of the reasons for untimeliness have become politically dominant, and they've become entangled with a new form of space skepticism and partly constitute the latter. Finally, a practical consideration from that: will growing human activities in space become a focus for dissent? Not necessarily, but I think that because of the shapeshifting of the space skepticism, and because of the ways in which the abandoning Earth notions or neglecting Earth notions have really hit a chord with a lot of people, I think that the conditions for some kinds of dissent over space have definitely become more present over, say, the last decade, and I suspect that might continue to be the case for the next few decades. So hold on to your seats for what is to come. And I'd just like to thank the organisers and the institutional supporters of the event for the opportunity to speak to everyone. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thanks to you. It was a wonderful presentation. And now we have 10 more minutes. If you want to ask something, please feel free to write your comments or questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to read the first question to both of you. Feel free to address like in any particular order you prefer. So this question came from Jean Valencia. How can space technology be effectively utilized to address global challenges such as climate change, resource scarcity, or disaster management? And second part of that same comment, what are the ethical implications of space exploration and colonization efforts? How can we ensure responsible and sustainable practices in space? And another question just arrived, so I will add that one too. Do you think that technological advancement has slower drastically since the space race due to a lack of public interest? Additionally, what will be a good tactic to unite the mindset of the general populace to support better advancement for space technologies? So please, Professor Anthony, Professor Simon, feel free to open your microphone, share your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to start on the first question, if that's right with you, Anthony.
Sure, go ahead.
So how can space technology be effectively utilized to address global challenges such as climate change, resource scarcity, or disaster management? Well, the thing is, it's already being utilized. If we didn't have space technology and the world had carried on as it has done, there would have been the industrialization, there would have been the plastics that have been produced, there would have been the difficulties that we see today, but we wouldn't have been able to look back on Earth with our Earth observation and understand what's happening. Maybe at this point in time, we wouldn't know as much. In fact, I would say we wouldn't know as much as we do right now. Space has been a part of things, is enabling us to help tackle these things, and will continue to help us tackle these things. That's not to say that those things should be denigrated or be seen or belittled. They are important, but so is space in that regard. Very briefly on those other two elements, I'm sure, Tony, you will want to mention something on those as well. With regards to the ethical implications of space exploration and colonization, from my perspective, anyone who goes out to space needs to be prepared adequately so that the risks on those individuals are minimal and are understood. I would only say that we are at a point in time with commercial human spaceflight where I would wonder, and I'm concerned, that we maybe do not know what is appropriate to adequately prepare someone. I'm talking about a commercial individual, a normal individual, a general member of the general public, to adequately prepare them to go into space. I'm not sure we're there yet, so there is work to be done there. And so that is an important question. And then the last point, how can we ensure responsible and sustainable practices? In my field of space life science, over the years, increasingly, it's got to the point where in order to conduct space life science research, we need to show that there is translation to terrestrial need, that there is a spin-off for terrestrial health purposes, or health benefit, I should say. Research that doesn't attend to that doesn't have that, tends not to get funded. Why can't there be something of a similar nature that looks at sustainability, where research that's being pursued for space purposes should take into consideration sustainability and show that that has been a consideration? That's not to say that all research will be able to provide something positive towards sustainability, but it should at least be considered. They're my thoughts. Tony, I don't know what you might have.
Great. I think we got lucky. Humanity got extremely lucky. We got satellite technologies just in time. Can you imagine circumstances of climate change without those technologies, without that capacity for monitoring? Can you imagine the situation that we would be in without the capacity to see what's happening in terms of earthquakes and responses of that sort? Why is it that you find smaller countries like Nepal and so on are interested in having their own satellites? Because they had a massive earthquake and lots of people died. they want the ways of mitigating the effects of that kind of thing. So at least in terms of relatively near to the Earth, then it's just a no-brainer. We absolutely need these technologies. They're completely integrated in our daily lifestyles in ways that we just never notice. But our lives would be completely different if it wasn't for the ongoing presence of various kinds of space technologies. Where the ethical arguments become harder is when you deal with the proliferation of various things and you think, well, we need this, but do we really need that? When you start to get CubeSats that are the size of Rubik cubes and the prospect of there being an awful lot of them, and how do you deal with that, and how will future generations deal with that? And when you start to get into these problems about what do we do when we get to the moon, and what do we do when we get to Mars, given that we only have one moon and we only have one Mars, and every human who exists in the future will only have that one moon and the one Mars. So you really don't want to mess up these places. And so there are different tiers and different forms of ethical problem that's here. You can very well be concerned about prospects for colonization of Mars, and at the same time say, yeah, but there's a lot of other space activities that we should engage in. You can very well take a position saying that, well, maybe we need some human presence in space. We certainly want the biological information about how that goes. And lengthening telomeres is like really, really important. That surprised me because I didn't know. I didn't know, and that's a big thing because that speaks about human longevity as such, and that's something that affects every human being on Earth. We can very well say that well, most of it's going to be robotic. I think that's probably an argument that holds for a while, and at some point in time we develop further technologies and expand further into space as well and go beyond those robotic presence. But we certainly want to have robust forms of protection on the moon, especially as things are heating up down at the South Lunar Pole at the moment as we speak. And we want robust forms of protection on Mars because you have these unique places and we can't go everywhere. We might be really restricted for a very long time, possibly forever, to the solar system and mostly to the inner solar system with that one Mars with very little surface area off of Earth. So we want to make sure that we really take care of these things. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we get the planetary science. We really need to know about cryosystems elsewhere. We need to know how polar ice behaves, and we need to know how atmospheres behave and how atmospheres interact with surfaces. We really need to know these things desperately because of climate change. That is the argument that Swan made in favour of saying, look, it might be a good time, it might not be a good time, but the climate change argument, we need the climate science, and that just looks to be the basic one. And finally, because I think I've spoken a bit much, finally, I don't think it's a lack of interest that creates problems for the technological advancement, because we're not fully in control of technologies, and we shouldn't really imagine that we are. They do have a dynamism of their own, and their development doesn't really result from us taking a ballot across society or some sort of some sort of metaphorical ballot of being in favour and being against them. I think that technologies roll on under their own impetus as it were, and that is one of the sources of concern that people have always had about technologies, that we want the technologies to live in our world, but we sometimes feel that we end up living in the world of the technologies, and that's a difficult thing to come to terms with because it means a lot of changes in the ways that we see things. I'll stop there.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah,
really quick, Maurizio, for that last answer. Due to lack of public interest, the interest in space since, say, the Apollo program, the space race days, has gone down, but not because of a lack of public interest. It's gone down because it was political drive and need that caused that massive space race, geopolitical tensions that caused that space race, and those geopolitical tensions have gone down in the decades since. I do believe there is still public interest. What would be useful to really engage with that public interest, I would say, if we can find an activity that is commercial so that it drives the desire to get out there and do that activity, but which does not detrimentally affect the moon or Mars or low Earth orbit, wherever the activity is, and which the product of, the outcome of, positively supports our difficulties on Earth, whether these be climate change, whether these be sustainability. If we can see that trio of factors in something, then we're going to really start seeing more increases in interest from the general public.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are just on time to finish our session. Thank you so much for both of you to this wonderful panel, Considerations on Space Technology and Innovation. Thank you to all the attendees to join us, make your questions, and please join us in the main room, room 1, for the keynote Getaway, Humanity's First Lunar Space Station, right away in just 9 minutes. Okay, so thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Maurizio. All the best.